He is remembered as the larger-than-life king who broke with the Pope, who married 6 wives, and who reshaped the course of English history forever. But when we peel back the royal portraits and the carefully polished myths, another Henry emerges. This Henry was not majestic, not noble, not the towering figure that courtiers were ordered to praise. In the end, he was something else entirely, broken, decayed, and terrifying even to those who once feared him most. The story of his body in those last years is not just grotesque, it is almost unthinkable. Because what really happened to Henry VIII was far darker than the pageantry of his reign. It was a descent into rot, pain, and paranoia that consumed the once mighty king until he was a living horror to everyone around him. Most people imagine Henry as the young, athletic monarch who dazzled Europe in his youth. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and known for his skill in jousting and hunting. At his coronation, he cut the figure of a warrior prince who seemed destined to rule with strength and glory. But that image hides the truth of his final years. By the end of his life, Henry weighed close to 400 pounds. His body was covered with sores that oozed pus. His stench was so overpowering that servants dreaded standing near him. It was not the picture of a divine ruler chosen by God. It was the picture of a man who had been ravaged by his own injuries and appetites, reduced to something monstrous. The turning point came not from age alone, but from a single violent moment. In 1536, Henry was thrown from his horse during a jousting match, and the massive animal crashed down upon him. The force of the accident left him unconscious for more than 2 hours. To his courtiers, it looked like the end had come that day. But Henry survived, and that survival came at a terrible cost. He rose from that accident a different man, physically broken and mentally scarred in ways that would never heal. From that day forward, his decline was relentless. The wound to his leg never truly closed. Instead, it became an open sore that festered for years. Physicians tried poultices and ointments, but nothing worked. Each time the wound split open, the stench filled the palace halls. It grew so foul that courtiers wrote in horror of how the smell reached across rooms, a putrid reminder that the king was rotting from within. The once vigorous monarch was now carried about in mechanical chairs, unable to walk more than a few steps without agony. His body swelled as his weight climbed, his mobility shrinking as his appetite grew unchecked. And with his body failing, his mind began to darken too. The accident seemed to shake something deep within him. Where once he had been bold and commanding, now he became unpredictable, consumed by violent rages and strange visions. The king, who had once been celebrated as the very embodiment of England, had become a figure that his own people whispered about in dread. The transformation in Henry after the accident was dramatic enough that even his closest advisors whispered about it. One courtier wrote that the king had become a different man in countenance and in spirit. The bright, ambitious monarch of his youth seemed to vanish overnight. In his place stood a ruler who could barely control his own body and who lashed out at the world around him with frightening intensity. The leg wound was not just a physical injury. It became a constant reminder of his fragility, poisoning his moods and clouding his decisions. Every step caused him pain, and every moment of discomfort seemed to fuel his temper. The sores that plagued him were more than a nuisance. They were a curse that dominated his daily life. Servants had to clean and dress them constantly, yet no matter how carefully they were tended, they continued to fester. The pain was excruciating, and the odor was unbearable. People spoke of the king's chambers smelling of death, the air thick with decay. Some described how his ulcers would burst, releasing pus that stained his clothing and bedding. Others recalled how courtiers struggled not to gag in his presence. To be near Henry in those years was to be confronted with the grotesque reality of a body falling apart. His weight added another layer of misery. Once a striking figure who cut through the lists with the grace of a knight, Henry now struggled to rise from a chair. He had to be carried in specially built contraptions because his legs could no longer support him. He grew so large that wide doorways were required to move him through his palaces. His frame, once admired, became a prison of flesh. The king who had once represented strength now embodied weakness and suffering. Historians and doctors looking back on his condition have suggested explanations that Henry himself could never have understood. Some believe he suffered from Cushing syndrome, a disorder that causes weight gain, fatigue, and skin problems. Others point to chronic osteomyelitis, a deep bone infection that could have caused his wounds to remain open and unhealed. Whatever the true diagnosis, the symptoms were clear to everyone around him. He was a king whose body betrayed him day after day, and there was no cure. And yet, despite his suffering, Henry's appetites did not diminish. He continued to feast, consuming lavish meals and drinking heavily. The food that once fueled his hunts and jousts now only deepened his decline. Doctors pleaded with him to show restraint, but the king was not a man to be denied. His diet filled his enormous body, even as it destroyed him further. Each banquet was both a display of power and a slow poisoning of the man himself. This physical decline fed directly into the storms that raged in his mind. His paranoia grew sharper, his temper more violent. Once celebrated for his charm, Henry became known for his sudden cruelty. A word, a glance, even silence could trigger his fury. Those who served him lived in constant fear, not only of his commands, but of his moods. The people closest to Henry soon realized that his moods were not just the anger of a sick man, but the shadows of a mind unraveling. Many today believe that the blow to his head during the jousting accident may have caused a traumatic brain injury. Symptoms such as violent mood swings, paranoia, and sudden bursts of rage align with what doctors now recognize as long-term effects of head trauma. To those in his court, though, it seemed as if the king had been touched by madness. He would speak to the empty air as if addressing people who were not there. Some swore he argued with his long-dead father. Others whispered that he saw the ghosts of the many men and women he had condemned to death. Whether these were true hallucinations or simply the guilt of a king drowning in blood, they terrified those who witnessed them. Paranoia gripped him like a constant hand at his throat. Henry could not sleep peacefully. He demanded armed guards in his bedchamber, men who would stand watch as he tossed and turned. He often clutched weapons while he slept, unwilling to trust anyone, even in dreams. He built a web of spies so tangled that some reported not only on his enemies but on other spies, each watching the other for signs of betrayal. The king, who once commanded respect with his presence, now ruled through fear, suspicion, and unpredictable violence. Stories spread of his cruelty growing worse with each passing year. It was said that he ordered executions for people who had already been put to death, as if his fury could not be satisfied by reality alone. He condemned friends and wives alike, convinced that betrayal lurked everywhere. The once brilliant politician and shrewd leader became a man consumed by shadows of his own making. His court was no longer a place of grandeur but of terror, where survival depended on reading his moods and avoiding his gaze. The weight of guilt and suspicion pressed heavily upon him, yet he never admitted weakness. Even in moments of clear decline, he demanded to be seen as England's master. He wore jewels and rich fabrics, though they strained against his swollen body. He staged processions and displays, though he could barely endure the ride. He needed the world to believe he was still the king of power and glory. But behind the velvet and gold was a body that was crumbling, and a mind that was fraying faster with each passing day. To his subjects, the king remained distant, a figure more legend than man. But to those within the palace walls, the reality was inescapable. The smell of rot that clung to his wounds, the sight of his body struggling against its own size, the wild look in his eyes as he accused friend and foe alike. These were the truths that defined Henry in his final years. The great monarch was becoming unrecognizable, and those closest to him wondered how much longer he could possibly endure. As the years dragged on, Henry's decline became impossible to disguise, even from the public. The king who once thundered across the jousting field was now rarely seen by his subjects. When he did appear, he was carried in elaborate chairs or hidden behind layers of rich clothing that could not mask his enormous size. Those who caught glimpses of him often spoke of their shock, for this was not the vibrant monarch they had known, but a man who seemed imprisoned in his own body. Rumors spread quickly, and though few dared to speak openly, whispers of the king's decay slipped through taverns and markets. Within the palace, the reality was harsher still. His leg ulcers worsened, splitting open again and again, each time filling the halls with their stench. Servants approached his chambers with dread, knowing that tending to the king's body could bring both danger and disgust. They were forced to lance the sores, to clean the pus that oozed out, all while praying they would not draw his wrath in the process. Many accounts suggest that even hardened men gagged or turned away when the foul odor filled the room. His very presence had become unbearable, and yet to refuse service was to risk death. The physical agony made Henry even more unpredictable. Pain gnawed at him constantly, twisting his temper into a weapon that struck at anyone near. Council meetings ended in shouting, with courtiers trembling under his gaze. He demanded loyalty, but rewarded it with suspicion. His wives and ministers never knew whether they would find favor or face ruin. The king's mind, like his body, seemed to be rotting from the inside. Medical theories suggest that the combination of chronic infection, obesity, and possible brain injury created a storm that no treatment of the time could have managed. Physicians bled him, purged him, and applied ointments, but none of it could halt the decline. In truth, their efforts often made things worse. The more they intervened, the weaker and more tormented he seemed to become. Yet Henry, who had once been a symbol of England's strength, refused to admit defeat. He demanded that the world still see him as powerful, even as his body betrayed him more each day. His paranoia deepened alongside his pain. He surrounded himself with guards, convinced that plots brewed everywhere. He tested his servants with impossible tasks, watching to see who would falter. Even his closest advisers were not safe from his suspicion. Some fell from grace overnight, accused of treachery without evidence. Others tried to maintain their standing by feeding his fears, ensuring their survival at the cost of truth. In the final years, Henry's court was less a center of governance and more a stage for his decaying power. The man who had once commanded Europe's attention had become a tyrant, trapped in his own torment, lashing out at shadows as much as enemies. By the final months of his life, Henry's decline could no longer be contained within palace walls. The man who had once commanded armies and reshaped religion was now reduced to a figure of pity and horror. His body swelled with such heaviness that he could barely lift himself without help. Even his most loyal attendants admitted privately that they feared for their own health when forced to clean his wounds. The stench clung to clothing and lingered in the corridors long after they had left his chamber. He was not the radiant king painted in portraits, but a suffering giant slowly collapsing under the weight of his own body. The sores on his legs became the greatest symbol of his decay. Physicians tried desperately to treat them, but every effort seemed in vain. When they attempted to lance the wounds, pus poured out in such quantities that it horrified even those used to blood and sickness. Some servants whispered that the ulcers seemed almost alive, a constant reminder that their king was rotting from within. At times, the pain was so great that Henry could not even move. His once booming voice often reduced to groans of agony. He demanded silence and obedience. Yet his subjects could not ignore the spectacle of his suffering. As his physical strength failed, his mind slipped further from reason. The paranoia that had haunted him for years now consumed every waking thought. He feared poison in his meals, betrayal in the eyes of his council, and rebellion in the whispers of the people. His sleep was broken by terrifying seizures that left him gasping for breath. Courtiers spoke of nights when the king thrashed violently, his face contorted, his body seizing in uncontrollable fits. To those who watched, it was as if the monarch of England was being attacked by unseen forces, his mind and body locked in a war he could not win. The once mighty ruler began to lose his ability to speak clearly. Strokes robbed him of his voice, leaving him struggling to form words. For a man whose command had once bent nations to his will, this silence was a cruel humiliation. Ministers leaned in close to catch his whispers, while enemies outside the palace waited for the inevitable end. The kingdom he had ruled with such ferocity now held its breath, watching a king slowly unravel before their eyes. Every day brought a new indignity. His meals, once feasts of luxury, had to be cut into small pieces for him, though he still ate with an appetite that shocked his physicians. His clothing had to be altered constantly to fit his growing body. He could no longer mount a horse, no longer ride in triumph before his people. Instead, he was carried like a relic, hidden away behind curtains and attendants who tried in vain to preserve the image of majesty. But no curtain, no jewel, no golden throne could disguise the truth of what Henry VIII had become. The final weeks of Henry's life were marked by a steady descent into misery. His body, already weakened by years of disease and indulgence, began to collapse completely. The ulcers on his legs no longer oozed in cycles. They poured constantly, leaving his chambers filled with the unbearable smell of infection. Physicians hovered helplessly, offering treatments that soothed nothing. They tried bleeding him, purging him, applying herbal salves, but the king's flesh refused to heal. Instead, it continued to rot, each day worse than the last. For his attendants, every moment near him was torture, not just for the risk of his fury, but for the stench that seemed to cling to their very skin. In those weeks, Henry's immense bulk made him almost immobile. He spent long stretches of time propped up in bed, breathing heavily, unable to rise without the aid of several men. He had once been the image of vigor and majesty, but now he was swollen, wheezing, and trapped in his own flesh. The great monarch was a prisoner inside his body, and even he seemed to sense that his end was approaching. Yet, even as his body betrayed him, he clung to the illusion of control. He issued orders, demanded reports, and lashed out when courtiers failed to hide their alarm at his condition. The seizures grew more frequent, terrifying those who witnessed them. His massive frame would convulse violently, his face turning purple as attendants rushed to restrain him. At times he foamed at the mouth, his body shaking as though struck by some unseen hand. To his physicians, these were signs of his body finally giving way. To the courtiers and servants, they seemed like visions of divine punishment. A king who had defied Rome and destroyed lives, now writhing in his final torment. Then came the strokes, stripping away his ability to speak. The man whose words had once decided the fate of nations could only mutter or gesture weakly. Ministers bent close to catch broken phrases, trying to interpret what little he could still express. The silence of their once commanding king was both heartbreaking and frightening. It was clear that the ruler who had towered over England was vanishing before their eyes, reduced to a husk of the man he had been. By mid-January of 1547, his decline could no longer be hidden. The court was gripped by tension as factions prepared for the inevitable. Who would succeed him? Who would hold power in the chaos that would follow? Behind the scenes, the machinery of succession was already in motion. But in Henry's chamber, there was only the sound of his labored breathing, the groans of a man ravaged by pain, and the quiet dread of those forced to watch him fade away. The king who had once terrified Europe was now terrifying in another way, not through power, but through the horror of his decay. The final days of Henry VIII were a grim vigil. By now he could barely speak, barely move, and his attendants knew the end was near. On January 27th, 1547, the king who had once bent an entire nation to his will slipped into silence. His body was so weakened that he could not rise from his bed. The seizures left him trembling and pale, and the strokes had stolen much of his voice. Yet even in those last hours, he clung stubbornly to life, as though refusing to admit defeat to death itself. Those gathered at his bedside spoke in hushed tones, aware that they were watching the collapse of a figure who had once dominated the stage of Europe. When death finally came, it was not noble or dignified. It was slow, painful, and terrifying. Accounts tell of Henry's final moments being marked by violent seizures and gasps for air. His enormous body heaved, his face twisted in agony. The monarch, who had once declared himself God's anointed ruler, now died in a scene of suffering that seemed almost biblical in its cruelty. At last, he slipped away, leaving behind not triumph, but horror. For those who had seen him rise to glory, it was almost unthinkable to see him end in such misery. But the true shock came after his death. As his body was prepared for burial, the full extent of his decay could no longer be hidden. His flesh was bloated and discolored. His wounds oozed with foul fluids even after life had left him. The stench of rot filled the chamber so powerfully that even seasoned attendants struggled to endure it. They wrapped him in layers of cloth and sealed his coffin as quickly as possible, hoping to contain the corruption. Yet the corruption of Henry's body could not be contained. On the long journey to his burial at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, the coffin itself became a gruesome spectacle. As it rested overnight in the church at Sion, something horrifying happened. The gases building inside his corpse forced their way out. The coffin swelled, cracked, and burst. Dark fluids seeped from the cracks and dripped onto the stone floor. According to legend, stray dogs crept into the church and licked at the remains that leaked from the coffin. To many, this was seen as divine judgment, a symbol that the king who had once claimed godlike authority was now reduced to filth, mocked even in death. The funeral continued with all the pomp of royalty, but beneath the velvet and the chants, everyone knew the truth. Henry's body had betrayed the image he had tried so hard to maintain. The man who had demanded to be remembered as England's greatest king was carried to his grave in a coffin that could not contain his corruption. In that moment, the illusion of majesty was stripped away, leaving only the undeniable reality of decay. The image of Henry's coffin leaking in the church at Sion spread quickly. To common people, it seemed like poetic justice. This was the man who had torn England from Rome, executed wives and allies, and ruled with a fist of iron. And now, in death, even his coffin could not hold him. The story of dogs licking at his remains became one of the most enduring images of his legacy, whispered from village to village as proof that divine punishment had caught up with the king. Whether the tale was fully true or not, it carried a truth that paintings and monuments could never erase. Henry VIII, the mighty monarch, had rotted away like any man, perhaps worse. His burial at Windsor was conducted with all the grandeur of royalty, but beneath the hymns and rituals, those present could not forget the horror of his corpse. The explosion of his coffin overshadowed the ceremony. Courtiers who had once trembled before his living wrath now shuddered at the memory of his decomposed body. For many, it was the ultimate humiliation. Henry had demanded obedience, worship, and eternal remembrance. Yet the final picture etched in the minds of his people was not of a glorious ruler, but of a bloated body leaking across the stones of a chapel floor. This was the climax of his story, the brutal truth of his downfall. The man who had claimed divine right and absolute power was reduced to decay, his last moments marked not by glory, but by grotesque collapse. It was a resolution no artist could paint and no court historian could polish. The ultimate conflict between his myth and his reality was settled not by battles or politics, but by the state of his corpse. And in the centuries since, that image has lingered, We remember Henry for his 6 wives, for the break with the Catholic Church, for the creation of the Church of England. But just as powerfully, we remember him as the king whose body betrayed him. His weight, his wounds, his paranoia, and his gruesome death tell a cautionary tale about the price of absolute rule. Power could not save him. Wealth could not protect him. Faith could not disguise his decay. In the end, Henry's story is not only about a king, but about the limits of human flesh and ambition. He sought to bend a kingdom to his will, to stand above all others, and to be remembered as a figure of strength and glory. Instead, his body revealed the truth, that even the most powerful man in England could rot, stink, and burst apart like anyone else. His final legacy is not just the England he left behind, but the haunting reminder that no crown, no title, and no power can make a man immortal. So when we ask what they really found inside Henry VIII's body, the answer is simple: corruption, disease, and the undeniable truth that kings die as men, no matter how hard they try to rise above it.